This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Mr. Joseph Cirincione, presenting his new book, Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late. Mr. Cirincione is president of Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation. He serves on the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the author of the previous books Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons, and Deadly Arsenals, Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Threats. Many people think that nuclear threats ended with the Cold War, or that current policies can prevent or contain nuclear disaster. They're dead wrong. These weapons, possessed by states large and small, stable and unstable, remain an ongoing threat. In this book, Mr. Cirincione surveys the best thinking and worst fears of experts specializing in nuclear warfare and assesses the efforts to reduce or eliminate these nuclear dangers. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Joseph Cirincione.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you for that gracious introduction. It was really a pleasure to be here. As I'm listening to you talk about the titles of my past books, I realized I got to get some more upbeat titles. You know, a few years ago, more than a few years ago, a decade ago, I was on the Jon Stewart show, and he introduced me with the author of Deadly Arsenals, a romance novel. Someday I'll write a nuclear romance novel. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to come tonight. And for those of you who are watching or listening online, thank you very much for taking that time as well. I know we all have a lot to do, and there's a lot going on in the world today. There's a lot going on in everybody's lives. We all have our own challenges and situations we have to confront, whether it's our business, our family, problems in our community that we're wrestling with, the results of the latest election that we're worried about. But of all the challenges we face, there are only two that actually threaten destruction on a planetary scale, and that's global warming and nuclear weapons. Both of these are caused by machines that we invented. Both of them present challenges and threats that actually can be reversed, rolled back, even fully prevented, but they both require new thinking and new ways of acting, and most importantly, some new politicians that have the courage to take the steps that are required to prevent these global dangers. I work exclusively on the nuclear side. That's all I do. I don't deal much with global warming, although there are some intersections between the two. Many people believe that in order to fully prevent global warming, you need a healthy wedge of nuclear power over the next few decades to reduce the carbon emissions that we generate to get our electricity. And if you spread nuclear power, you are actually increasing the chances that more and more people will use a nuclear power program to acquire nuclear weapons. The technology is the same. Not the reactor itself. Lots of countries have reactors that don't have nuclear weapons programs, but the technologies for making the fuel for those reactors, for enriching the uranium for the fuel rods, or for reprocessing the spent fuel rods to dispose them in a more economical manner. That reprocessing produces plutonium, another ingredient for nuclear weapons. So the two are connected in that way. What I want to do just briefly here tonight is talk to you a little bit about why I've spent my life working on reducing this threat, what's going on right now, what are some of the key issues right now, and what I think might be happening over the next couple of years. And then let's open it up for questions and we can discuss whatever you'd like. When experts think about the nuclear dangers we face, they usually categorize them in order of probability. And none of these are highly probable. These are all remote events. The trouble is, none of them are impossible. And nature teaches us that whatever is not expressly prohibited by the laws of nature will happen. Shuttles blow up. Tsunamis hit nuclear power plants. Mistakes are made that trigger global wars. So the rare occurrences occur all the time. And if, in this case, if one of these rare occurrences happen, number one on our list is a terrorist group acquiring a nuclear weapon. If ISIS were to get its hands on a nuclear weapon, very few people doubt they would use that weapon, at least to threaten, almost certainly followed by mass destruction. Fortunately, ISIS is very far away from getting a weapon. They can't make it themselves. They can't make the material. They can't make the highly enriched uranium or plutonium. That requires an industrial enterprise. That requires billions of dollars, gigawatts of energy. This could be Hillary Clinton's next book. It takes a nation to make the material for a nuclear weapon. But if they could get the nuclear material, say from some of the unsecure stockpiles in Russia, or from turmoil in Pakistan, a country that has 100 nuclear weapons and material for at least 100 more, then fashioning a device out of that material is hard, it's challenging, but it would cost them approximately $10 million, experts figure, to hire the expertise, the metallurgists, the machinists, the physicists who would be necessary to fashion a crude Hiroshima-type device. And then delivering that device, smuggling it into the United States, is a fairly easy matter. As Sam Nunn always jokes, if you want to smuggle a nuclear weapon in the United States, put it in a bale of marijuana. We know we can't stop that. And then, of course, there's no shortage of suicide bombers or threats. The real nightmare scenario here is that a group, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, some other group you haven't yet heard of yet, they seem to get worse and more apocalyptic every decade, announces that they've smuggled 2 nuclear weapons into the United States, one in Washington and one in Miami. And if we don't do what they say, for example, if we don't pull all U.S. troops out of the Middle East, they will detonate those devices. And then to prove they're serious, they detonate the one in Miami. So I'm sorry, you had to go to make their point. And so what does the president do at that point? There is no good choice. He can't give in to the terrorist demands, but he can't sit back and let Washington blow up. But there's nothing you can do to stop this devilish dilemma at this moment. So when we war game these, and national security officials walk through these every few years, there's a war game run at the highest level about this kind of terrorist threat. The point of it is to show you that there's no good answers at that point. So you got to roll the whole game back and say, okay, what do I have to do now to make it impossible for that point ever to arrive? And there's a whole set of programs that we've devised to try to secure the nuclear materials around the world, to try to reduce them. And we have those programs next April in the United States. The President of the United States will hold the last of his nuclear security summits, something he started in 2010 in Washington when he had leaders from almost 50 countries come to the United States to pool best practices, to agree on how to reduce the stockpiles of material that they had. Some of these countries are weapons countries. Some of them are countries that make nuclear fuel. But if you're making that nuclear fuel or storing that nuclear fuel, it's a potential terrorist threat. This process has worked. We've steadily reduced the amount of this material in the world over the last 8 years. We've secured it to much higher levels. In many countries, this kind of material is secured no more tightly than one secures a library book. And it should be secured like the gold in Fort Knox. We haven't lost an ounce of gold from Fort Knox. We shouldn't lose an ounce of highly enriched uranium any place in the world. But it's not all secured. It's not all locked up. It's not all being reduced. So we're in a race to try and do this before something terrible happens. Again, Sam Nunn, in that way that he talks. I wish I was a former Southern senator and could talk like this. We're in a race between catastrophe and cooperation. And so people at the highest levels are concerned about this. In the National Security Strategy of the United States, it lists the threats to the United States. The number one threat to the United States is the risk of a nuclear terrorist attack. Not because it's most likely, but because the consequences are so catastrophic that when you plug this thing into a standard risk calculation equation, probability times consequences, you come up with a big, big number at the end. So you have to do whatever you can to make this occurrence as remote as possible. The second threat that we worry about, the second threat listed in the National Security Strategy of the United States, is the spread of these weapons to other countries. When we detonated the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki 70 years ago, scientists who had built the bomb warned that if we did this without having a system in place of strict arms controls, it would set off a nuclear arms race that would be uncontrollable. It didn't happen right away. Our intelligence agencies predicted it would take the Soviet Union 10, 20 years to mimic our mastery of the bomb, our mastery of the atom. But 4 years later, in 1949, the Soviets exploded their own bomb, way ahead of where we thought they would be at the time. A few years later, Great Britain detonated a nuclear weapon, 1952. 1960, France did it. And in that year, some may remember Kennedy debating Richard Nixon. He warned then that if we didn't do something in 15, 20, or 25 years, that in the next decade, there might be 15, 20, or 25 more countries with nuclear weapons. And a lot of these were our allies. Australia, Germany, who we had just defeated in World War II, was working on programs for the bomb. Sweden had a plan to build 100 nuclear weapons, as well as countries like Egypt at the time, Turkey, exploring the option, because we had made the nuclear weapon a symbol of national power. If you were going to be a real power in the region or in the world, if you're going to have a real modern military, you should have nuclear weapons. That was the thinking. And that's what the government then set out to try to change. And it's a real good example of the power of policy. The choices you make matter. The United States didn't just threaten other people, it didn't just build up more nuclear weapons, although we did go nuclear nuts in the 50s and 60s. We went from about 200 bombs in 1949 to about 20,000 by the time Kennedy was sworn in as president. We had nuclear weapons for everything. Every service demanded they had nuclear weapons. So not just nuclear weapons on missiles, not just nuclear weapons on bombers, but now nuclear weapons on submarines. We had nuclear landmines, nuclear torpedoes. My favorite is the nuclear bazooka that the Army had. I swear to God. We had a nuclear bazooka called the Davy Crockett. It was a two-person weapon. It was like a tube on a tripod. They usually mounted it at the back of a Jeep, and it would fire a 1 kiloton warhead, which is 1,000 tons of TNT, about a quarter of a mile. Now, why anyone would want to fire a nuclear weapon a quarter of a mile is beyond me, and even the Army figured this out after a while. And by the end of the 1960s, we no longer fielded the Davy Crockett. But we had perfected the art of making very small mobile nuclear weapons, and other countries then did the same thing. This is coming back to haunt us in Pakistan, which I'll get to in a minute. But instead of just threatening, instead of using, as President Obama says, bellicose words and threats of military action, we use something more powerful. We use diplomacy. Kennedy started the negotiations for the NonProliferation Treaty. Johnson continued them. He told Dean Rusk to go get me that treaty. And Nixon signed it in a flourish in the Rose Garden in 1970, saying we will look back and hopefully see this moment as the time the nuclear arms race took a more benign turn. And he was right. That treaty that recognized the 5 nuclear powers, China had detonated a weapon by then in 1964, and said, okay, you get to keep your nuclear weapons for a while, as long as you promise to negotiate in good faith reductions and their eventual elimination. And all the other countries of the world promise that they will not acquire those nuclear weapons. And in exchange, those countries with nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, for energy, for isotope production and cancer treatments, will share that technology with you. And it set up this system of international negotiations to reduce nuclear weapons, a ban against new countries getting them, and a method for exchanging nuclear technology coupled with strict inspections. So the International Atomic Energy Agency that had begun under President Eisenhower now was charged with these kinds of inspections. Fine. Not every country joins that pact. A lot of countries don't want anything to do with it. India declares that it's nuclear apartheid, they call it. This is just the white nations of the world. I don't know how they counted China, but the white nations of the world telling the rest of us that we shouldn't get the nuclear weapons. Pakistan, therefore, didn't join. Israel didn't join. They acquired nuclear weapons in 1968. India explodes what they called a peaceful bomb in 74. But it really isn't until 1998 that India and Pakistan do weapons tests. And other countries are pursuing this, some openly, like Argentina and Brazil, some clandestinely, like Iraq or Libya or South Africa, but they are pursuing it. Cycle forward to now. This treaty has been probably the most successful national security pact in history. Almost every country of the world has joined it, except for India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, which is left. Most of the countries of the world have kept the terms. They have not acquired those weapons. More countries have actually abandoned nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons programs in the last 30 years than have tried to acquire them. And these were some tough cases. Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan that got nuclear weapons with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Thousands of nuclear weapons. Voluntarily gave them up with U.S. assistance, with Russian cooperation, cut their bombers and subs that they had gotten into pieces, and joined the NonProliferation Treaty, promising never to get them. South Africa, on the eve of transition to majority rule, declared that it had secretly built 6 nuclear weapons and it was now destroying them. Now, clearly the apartheid regime didn't want the black majority having those nuclear weapons. But Nelson Mandela could have reversed the decision. He did not. Not because of a commitment to some idealist notion that nobody in the world should have nuclear weapons, although that was one of his considerations, because he made a hard-nosed strategic calculation that South Africa was better off in a continent where no one had nuclear weapons, where there was no arms race, where there was no weapon that could threaten to wipe out Johannesburg. And so he joined, and so did all the other countries of Africa. Africa is a nuclear-free zone. The whole continent has joined this treaty. Nobody has nuclear weapons. Argentina and Brazil gave up their nuclear weapons in the late 1980s, and they negotiated a treaty with the rest of the countries of South America. South America is a nuclear-free zone. No country in South America, all the way from Mexico down, has nuclear weapons. There are other nuclear-free zones in Southeast Asia, and there's one being negotiated in Central Asia. There are other. Most of the countries of the world don't have nuclear weapons. There's only 9 that do. And this is the third threat that we face. The possibility that something's going to go terribly wrong with the 16,000 existing nuclear weapons in the world, and a lot of this nuclear nightmares is about that threat. We have, between us, U.S. and Russia have about 95% of all the weapons in the world. So we have about 7,000, Russia has about 7,000. The rest are divided up, first among our allies. France has about 350. Why France has 350 nuclear weapons is a constant question. UK has about 165. China has about 200. India, Pakistan have about 120 each. And then North Korea, the newest and maybe the last country to join the nuclear club, has got enough material for about 10 weapons. They actually haven't been able to weaponize a bomb yet. They don't have a bomb ready for delivery. They've had 3 tests. The last one actually went off as planned, so we know they can do this. They just haven't weaponized it yet. And that's it. That's the nuclear inventory.
What about Israel?
I'm sorry, I missed Israel. Thank you. They have 100 nuclear weapons, approximately. Estimates vary. Some go as high as 200. I personally believe it's about 100. On a triad like we do, they have planes that can deliver them and missiles that can deliver them, medium-range missiles, and submarines they bought from the West Germans, which they put nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. So they're pretty well stocked. The danger with this is that something will go terribly wrong. And we have actually, although I'm here to talk about my book, Nuclear Nightmares, the best book written on this subject since Richard Rhodes wrote Making of the Atomic Bomb is called Command and Control by Eric Schlosser. You may know Eric Schlosser from his book Fast Food Nation, which was made into a movie called Food, Inc. He spent 6 years writing a book called Command and Control, which talks about the lapses of command and control over the past 70 years, the mistakes where things happened, where things went wrong, where we accidentally dropped 2 hydrogen bombs on South Carolina, for example, or 5 hydrogen bombs when a bomber broke up over Spain, or the bombs we lost off the coast of Greenland, or the missile silo that blew up in Arkansas when Bill Clinton was governor and threw a multi-megaton hydrogen bomb hundreds of feet in the air. It didn't detonate because one safety switch fortunately held and didn't blow up Arkansas, an incident that could have changed history at the time. And there's numerous examples of this, false alarms where we came very, very close. Let me just give you one current so you know this is not just a problem that was a problem during the Cold War and ended. One of the closest we ever came to nuclear weapons outside the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Robert F. Kennedy famously wrote that he looked at the White House lawn that morning in October and thought this might be the last morning I ever see. And a lot of people thought that in the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's stories we came in even closer to war than people know. There were more nuclear weapons. We knew there were missiles in Cuba. We didn't actually think they had nuclear weapons at the time of the crisis. We now know they had about 150 nuclear weapons there, and Castro was ready to launch. And he argued with Nikita Khrushchev. He said, if they attack us, we want to launch. But that's scary in and of itself, but it's 1960s. In 1995, the Cold War is over. Boris Yeltsin is the leader of Russia. One lovely warm day, the Norwegians launch a weather rocket over the Barents Sea. The deteriorating Russian early warning system picks it up and thinks it's a U.S.-launched ballistic missile from one of our submarines that patrol near the Barents Sea. And in some scenarios, this is how the U.S. would launch a nuclear war. One weapon going over, a large bomb detonated that blinds the enemy's radars and electronics, followed by salvos of missiles. The Russian military in 1995 was convinced that was what was happening. For the first time in the nuclear age, they came to the leader of Russia and opened up the nuclear suitcase. That suitcase that follows the leader of Russia and the leader of the United States around all the time, every day. When they're sleeping, there's somebody outside their door with that suitcase. We call it the football. It opens up, it has the buttons, it has the codes to launch each country's nuclear weapons. Boris Yeltsin was told, we're under attack, you have to launch. And this is the strategy that both sides have. It's called launch under attack. You have to launch your weapons before the other side can hit them, or else they're destroyed. You have 12 minutes, 12 and a half, if everything works according to plan.
Donald Trump.
12 minutes. Whoever. To decide. Boris Yeltsin didn't believe that this was actually happening. Fortunately, he wasn't drunk on that day. He decided to wait. They waited, more information came in, it was clear this was not a ballistic missile launch. They closed the suitcase, they went away, the world was saved. What we have to worry about is what happens if that scenario happens now, when there is no trust, when there is no confidence, when tensions are high, when the military and the political leadership might think, yes, the U.S. is attacking, or the other way around if something goes wrong on our side. You have to be a real optimist to think that we can keep 16,000 nuclear weapons in fallible human hands and nothing is going to go wrong. Something is going to go wrong. A finger will slip. A circuit will fail. An analysis will be wrong. So this race between catastrophe and cooperation is real on all these levels. It's not just the bad guys with nuclear weapons we have to worry about, it's the weapons we have to worry about wherever they are. These are machines that we built, that we invented, and they threaten to destroy everything else we've invented, including human civilization. Okay, here's one more nightmare scenario, and then I'll stop. about but why at least part of what you do has to be thinking about this, has to be worrying about this. And this one is what happens in South Asia. In my book, I have a chapter called The Most Dangerous Nation on Earth. It's about Pakistan, our ally, Pakistan. Pakistan is what they call a major non-NATO ally. We give them billions of dollars in military aid every year. We cooperate with Pakistan on Afghanistan, on fighting the Taliban or trying to stop them from aiding the Taliban. In many other areas, we cooperate with Pakistan. Pakistan has about 100 nuclear weapons. They're building new nuclear weapons faster than any country on Earth, including these tactical, small, portable nuclear weapons.
The bazookas?
Not the bazookas, but I can't remember if this is in the open literature or not. But let's say they're building small, portable weapons that could be put on planes, on rockets, on other delivery mechanisms. Their government is unstable. Their economy is in shambles. They have strong fundamentalist influences in their military and intelligence apparatus. They have Al-Qaeda and now ISIS, and Al-Qaeda and ISIS-like organizations operating in their national territory. And the region of the world that they're in is going through one of the most profound geopolitical convulsions in decades. Oh, and they also have fought 4 wars with their nuclear-armed neighbor, India. None of those wars were fought when each side had nuclear weapons. So what you're worried about is what happens if there's another war. In all the war games that we have done, trying to game out that sequence, the war games always goes nuclear. They always go nuclear. India has a strategy of rapidly mobilizing in case of a crisis to go to their border regions. Pakistan has a strategy of using these tactical nuclear weapons to try to defeat a conventional Indian invasion of Pakistan. We've calculated out that the use of just 100 nuclear weapons in such an exchange, and if such an exchange began, it would involve almost certainly at least 100 nuclear weapons. If that were to happen, it would be devastating for the subcontinent. Hundreds of millions of people would die. It would be catastrophic for the global economy, which would come to a screeching halt over this. But here in Miami, we wouldn't actually feel it. We wouldn't get any radiation, at least not immediately. Nobody here dies. So it's a terrible, terrible, catastrophic. The world has never seen anything like it, disaster. But life over here goes on pretty much as normal, at least at first. Because what we now know is that catastrophe would put enough smoke and particulates into the air from the burning, dense, mostly wooden urban centers of South Asia that it would ring the earth with a cloud that would last 2 or 3 years that would drop global temperatures 2 to 3 degrees. And on a day like this in Miami, you think maybe that's not so bad. And maybe that's a counter to global warming, but the problem is you drop the temperatures 2 or 3 degrees around the world and you kill most food crops in the world. Scientists estimate that would cause a famine that might kill as many as 1 billion people or more. And that is a Mad Max scenario. That is an apocalyptic scenario. That is the stuff of science fiction, except it could really happen and we could do it, and it could happen because we didn't do enough to control the nuclear weapons, to reduce the conflicts when we had the chance. Closing right now. Fortunately, we have people in government and on the outside who really are pushing to do more on this front. We have, as President Obama, a man who came into office as one of the most sweeping, ambitious, and realistic nuclear policies ever brought into the White House. He's implemented a great deal of it, but it's been stymied. It's been stymied by political opposition. It's been stymied by the Russians, who are not cooperating with us on this area. It's been stymied because the global crises around the world scare people so much that when people get scared, they don't want to talk about arms control. They want to talk about more arms. Even though exactly the opposite is true, people get panicked and they want to keep their hands on all the weapons they have, whether it's personal or national. I was in the White House on Saturday. A few of us were brought in. I don't think this is breaking any confidences. We were brought into the Situation Room. It which is a room about this size with TVs on the wall. And we were asked to tell the senior officials there what we would recommend the president do in his last 14 months in office. What could you do on this agenda? What could you do more than what he's already done, which has been substantial? But he hasn't actually cut that number of many nuclear weapons. The process between the U.S. and Russia is at a standstill. He's just negotiated an historic agreement with Iran that stops Iran from getting a bomb for at least a generation, and one of the major things that any president has done since the days of Kennedy and Nixon and Johnson, to stop that wave of proliferation. But what could you do now? In case you haven't noticed, this is not a president that's coasting to the finish. He's got 14 months in office, and he's moving. He's moving to do whatever he can, and I would watch this space. Watch what President Obama does on nuclear policy. Watch what the candidates for office are talking about in their debate on Friday, if they're Democrats, in the debates to come, if they're Republicans. And you, as citizens, can make a difference on this. You have to let the politicians who want your vote know what you want them to do in exchange for your vote, that this is an issue you care about. In addition to everything else that's going on, in addition to every issue, please add this to your list of things you want the president to do. You want the next president of the United States to reduce the nuclear threats to the planet. You want this president to use every remaining week he has in office to take steps to reduce that threat, not just so the bad guys don't get nuclear weapons, but that no nuclear weapon anywhere is ever used again. I've gone on too long, but let me stop right there and open it up for your questions. Thank you very much for letting me talk to you. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Two-part question. One is, when you were in the White House, can you share with us what you recommended?
Yes. Yes. You know, there's this doctor saying, the oath the doctors take, first, above all, do no harm. And so the first thing I recommend the president do, and I actually have been meaning to write this article up as soon as I finish the other article I was supposed to finish today, which is first, stop doing negative things. The administration has been critical of some nuclear disarmament groups who want to go further faster than the administration policies. And I support the administration policies, but there are some people pushing a ban on nuclear weapons. Some of these people are lefties in Europe. Some of them are the Pope in the Vatican. Pope Francis thinks it's long past due for us to prohibit these weapons, were the words he used at the United Nations. Not eliminate, which is the word in the NonProliferation Treaty, and which is the goal of U.S. presidents ever since Harry Truman, but prohibit. So a treaty banning these nuclear weapons. Even if the U.S. doesn't agree with these groups, they should stop. They should understand that they're allies in this fight and not the enemies. The second thing they could do is they could stop having the Secretary of Defense keep saying that nuclear weapons are the backbone of our national security structures. They are not. He should stop saying that they're essential to the security of the United States. They are not. He should stop protecting them from the budget cuts that are coming. Nuclear weapons are the weapons we need the least, and yet we're embarked on a program currently underway to spend $1 trillion on new nuclear weapons over the next 30 years. The nuclear arsenal that we have, that was weapons that were started under the Reagan administration, is reaching the end of their operational life. If you want to keep these weapons, you have to replace them. People in charge of these weapons are doing what we told them to do to maintain the safety and security of these weapons and make sure we have the best nuclear weapons in the world. That's what we told our soldiers and sailors and scientists to do, and that's what they're doing, so they're coming up with new programs to replace them. Nobody has turned it off. This is a machine that will self-perpetuate. The entire Cold War arsenal is going to be replaced over the next few years. The decisions are being made this year in the budget, next year, the year after that, and if we don't turn this machine off in the next 3 years, we're going to be locked in. Once you start bending metal, it's real hard for the Congress, for the Defense Department, for the President to stop a program. Let me give you one quick example. The bomber. We have two bombers that deliver nuclear weapons, the B-52 and the B-2. they're reaching the end of their lives. The B-2 never worked very well. The B-52 worked remarkably well, but even that ageless plane is coming to the end. We're going to build a new bomber. It's dubbed the B-3. We think the program is going to cost at least $100 billion, build about 100 planes, so at least $1 billion a plane. The contract was just let last week to Northrop Grumman, which spent millions lobbying people to get that contract. That's what you're up against. Millions of dollars being spent to secure these contracts. I think the Obama administration, I've urged them, they should delay the procurement of these new systems. You don't have to cancel them, which is really hard to do at this point. Just delay them. We have a policy procurement gap. The policy that says how many nuclear weapons do we need in 2050 has not yet been put into place, but the contracts are racing through the Pentagon, racing through Congress. So the biggest single thing the president can do is delay these contracts. There's a couple of particularly questionable programs, like a new nuclear cruise missile, that could be delayed without any harm to U.S. national security. You could reduce the buy of some of these weapons even if you decide to keep them. There's about 5 or 6 other steps, but those are the ones I think are the most important to take. Yes, sir.
What would be the consequences of an imaginary situation such as maybe that Al-Qaeda or ISIS are shooting a bazooka type of bomb into Assad premises with some suicide bomber or something like that? What exactly will happen as a consequence to the environment and so on?
Right. So the question is, what would happen if ISIS used a nuclear weapon in Syria? Right. So not against us, but used a nuclear weapon, right, which is not a far-fetched scenario. And we have some indication.
Russian also, they are facing now the Russian together with Assad, so they're even more desperate.
So the threat of nuclear terrorism is actually relatively new. Because up until the emergence of Al-Qaeda, most terrorist groups weren't interested in causing mass casualties. They were fighting over territory. They were fighting over control of the country. They were fighting over policies. So they wanted to terrorize a government to stop or for a particular policy, but they weren't interested in killing hundreds or thousands of people. Al-Qaeda changed that. This more messianic apocalyptic terrorism that emerged. And others have copied it. And ISIS has now exponentially advanced it. A couple of years ago, Mr. Obama got in trouble because he warned Assad that if he crossed a red line and used chemical weapons on a large scale, he would attack Syria, attack Assad. And Assad's troops, the Syrian army, started to use some of the chemical weapons that they have. Most of the chemical weapons in the world have been eliminated through treaties, through agreements. It was George H.W. Bush, the Republican, who negotiated the Chemical Weapons Convention, under which we gave up 20,000 tons of our nuclear weapons. The Russians gave up 30,000 tons of their nuclear weapons, and most countries in the world that had these, chemical weapons, gave them up. A couple of countries stayed outside that pact. Syria was one of them. They had about 1,000 tons of chemical weapons. We did not attack Syria, but the reason we didn't attack it is because Assad agreed to give up those chemical weapons, which we did. We moved 1,000 tons of not just mustard gas, which is deadly, that's a World War I type weapon, but deadly sarin and VX nerve gases, a drop of which on your skin will kill you. So we moved those out. So we are real fortunate that that has happened, because the country since that moment has descended even further into chaos, and it's almost certain that ISIS would have acquired some of that nerve gas, and if they had, they would use it, because we think they're using some chlorine or some mustard gas. There's some evidence of that now. So I'm bringing this up because the evidence is, if they have these weapons, the evidence is pretty clear they will use them. Here's the really scary part. A couple of weeks ago, a story broke that disclosed that in Moldova and in Georgia, countries that most of us don't know, couldn't pick out on the map, there were people who had nuclear material that could be used either, in some cases it was highly enriched uranium, or to construct a nuclear weapon, or nuclear highly radioactive material, cesium in particular, that could be used for a dirty bomb. A dirty bomb is a conventional bomb, dynamite, laced with radioactive material that can contaminate tens of square blocks if exploded. And these people were trying to sell it to ISIS, not just on the market trying to sell it, but particularly trying to sell it with ISIS. So you see this fusion of an anti-Americanism in some parts of Russia and the former Russian republics, fusing with this apocalyptic terrorism. That link hasn't been made yet. The people who have this material haven't found the channel to get it to the people who want it. But sooner or later, that's going to happen. Sooner or later, that's going to happen unless we do something about it. And that's the real threat. If ISIS were to get cesium or highly radioactive materials, I think they almost certainly would use it in a terror attack. I don't know if they would use it on their territory that they want to acquire, because it contaminates an area that they hope to occupy. I'm not sure they would use a nuclear bomb in territory that they want to acquire. I think it's more likely they would smuggle it, and this is what's so terrifying about ISIS, because we've never seen a group like this before. This is a terrorist group unlike anything in history. This is a group that is rich. They have about $2 billion. They control territory larger than some nations. They have an international recruiting mechanism. People from dozens of countries have come in. And that means they can run that, they can use those resources, they can use that territory to build weapons, and they can run that recruitment machine in reverse and get people back into some of the countries to deliver some of the weapons they could create. So that is the emergence of ISIS is one of the things that accelerates the concern about nuclear terrorism, either an explosive nuclear bomb, Hiroshima size, or a dirty bomb, a conventional, true terror weapon that could happen. Yes?
Now that you've completely scared the hell out of me, I was able and lucky enough to hear one of Plowshare's grantees talk about the Iran nuclear deal. And she said, which felt hopeful to me because I worried about the 23-day or 24-day inspection timeline. She said that was one of the greatest coups of the agreement.
Yeah.
And could you tell us why?
Yeah, sure. So my talk has been focused on the threat, which has, I do this to help you understand, number one, why, really, with all the things you have to worry about, you should add this to your list. And number two, why people like me do this thing. I mean, it's not just some idealist notion that we want to create a federation of planets sometime in the future. We're doing this because we really think this is a thing that can change life as we know it. And here's the hopeful part, there are things you can do about it. This is nothing inevitable about this threat, either global warming or nuclear weapons. You can have policies that stop this. And I don't mean going to war and attacking people. I mean what we've just seen in the case of Iran. After the agreement with Iran, I was on the Rachel Maddow show, and she called the Iran agreement the greatest diplomatic triumph in a generation or more. The New York Times calls it the most significant diplomatic breakthrough in recent history. President Obama just went to the UN and talked about it. Now it's his own agreement, but he said this is a counter to the notion that the only strength that matters is bellicose words and threats of military force, and that diplomacy and negotiations can't work. Well, we just negotiated a treaty that stops Iran from getting a bomb, that prevents a new war in the Middle East, that strengthens the international norm against nuclear weapons, and is a clear demonstration, and this is his words, of how the international system can deliver when it works the way it's supposed to work. And that's what you have here, an international agreement with a number of innovations. One of those innovations, the one you ask about, is how we deal with inspections. This agreement allows for the most intrusive inspections ever negotiated. Iran's program is going to be shrink-wrapped. We're going to shrink it down to a fraction of its current size. This week, they have started removing their centrifuges. They're going to cut their centrifuges by 2/3. These are the main threat that we worried about. These are the machines that could be used to enrich uranium. It's going to be cut down by 2/3 and other measures. It's then going to wrap that in an inspection regime with state-of-the-art cameras and sensors and seals. Not Game of Thrones wax seals on parchment, but fiber optic radio frequency seals. So if they break a canister, if they open a door they're not supposed to, if they fiddle around with material in a sealed warehouse, the signal goes off instantly, like an alarm at home, and headquarters in many places around the world are immediately alerted. But that just covers the declared sites where they've agreed that these could go, and that's dozens of sites in their country. But what happens if you see some suspicious activity in a far-off military base that doesn't have seals or inspectors or cameras? Well, this deal gives you the right to go and inspect that. And that right currently exists, but a country, when the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, says, I want to inspect this site, the country can refuse. And these disputes can take years. We have a site in Iran that we wanted to inspect for 10 years. We've been blocked from getting into that until recently, the Parchin site. So this agreement does something that's revolutionary in the inspection world. It puts a cap on how long the dispute can last. We want to go into this site, the Iranians say, no, there's a mechanism that is clearly laid out, and it can last a maximum of 24 days. At the end of 24 days, if Iran doesn't comply, they're automatically in violation of the agreement. That means they're hauled before the UN Security Council, and the sanctions, which we will lift if they have complied with the destruction of their equipment as the deal spells out, those sanctions would immediately be snapped back on. So you have a cap on an inspection, you have an automatic penalty system that can get put in very quickly. Nothing like this has ever existed, and that's why many people in my field are calling this a new gold standard for non-proliferation agreements. This is what every agreement should look like. This is what every country should have as the rules of the road, and there are many more like that. So I know you've heard a lot of exaggerated stories about why this deal is a catastrophe or just barely good enough. I'm telling you, this is the strongest non-proliferation agreement I have ever seen, and that includes the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This lays out a path for all future agreements. Yes, sir. I'll get back to you in a minute. Yeah.
I don't know much about it. I've understood that they can now reach Alaska with their delivery system, which of course is a military center for us.
Yeah. And
it's interesting to me. But also I'm wondering about the effect of money. As you mentioned,
yeah,
people like ISIS have a lot of money, and they don't have any. What could they actually be doing, and how could that affect the world?
Sure. You know, we have very good knowledge of what Iran is doing. Iran is probably the most watched country on earth. And we've had our intelligence, it's not just what we know from the inspections and negotiations, it's what our intelligence systems know. And Israeli intelligence, which we cooperate with very closely, and the French and the Germans and the Brits, etc. We know a lot about what the Iranians are doing. We don't know as much about the North Koreans. It's a tighter, more secretive society. Very hard for Western intelligences to penetrate. But we do know a bunch. It's amazing what you can find out if you just look hard enough. It's like, what is it Yogi Berra saying? It's amazing. Never mind, I forget. It's amazing what you can observe if you watch hard enough. We know that we had an agreement with North Korea in the 90s that froze their bomb program, stopped their plutonium production in place, stopped them from building the weapons. The Bush administration came in and had a different view of that agreement, didn't like it at all. And when the North Koreans started to violate some terms of it, the Bush administration ended the agreement, broke it off. North Korea then went on to start producing plutonium again. This is the core of their bomb. They don't use centrifuges. they use the reactor method. And they've now gone on to build centrifuges. So now we have a double threat. They got both methods going on. They tested 3 bombs. We think they're producing enough. They have enough material from their existing fuel supply to build maybe 10. And they're enriching enough uranium that they could start to sharply escalate. It could be 20, 30 bombs. They haven't yet perfected the technology to miniaturize it. So they can build a crude Hiroshima-type device. Maybe you've seen the pictures of those Hiroshima devices. They were big. You know, they were very, very large. In fact, we had to dig a hole under in the runway in order to put the bomb and then roll the plane on top of it in order to be able to lift it on to the B-29 that dropped the bomb. It was that awkward, that big a device. You want to put it on a warhead? That's another exponential leap in technology, to shrink it down to that size. You can do it eventually. They haven't done it yet. So they have missiles that can hit Alaska, but they can't carry a nuclear bomb on it. It's possible that one of these missiles could be put in a trajectory that it could actually hit California. But we joke about the payload would have to be so small, it'd have to be the golf ball of death, that it's not. They don't have the load capacity. So we're not worried about a missile threat from them. And so all this emphasis on missile defenses is completely misplaced. This is not the threat we're going to face from either North Korea or Iran or, frankly, almost any other country. And the missile technology, the anti-missile technology is so porous that I believe it's impossible to build an effective missile defense system. What you're worried about is something else. A Korean device that's put on a tanker that we failed to detect, or shipped in some other way to the United States. And that's a threat, and that's what you're worried about. Here's a little bit of good news. The Iran deal sort of offers a path out for North Korea. It shows them that you can negotiate with the United States, and if this holds, and have a deal where we don't actually overthrow the regime, that we're willing to make a deal with a regime that we can't stand in order to eliminate the threat that we want to get rid of the most. There's also been increased cooperation and discussions recently between South Korea and North Korea, which is a hopeful sign. And most importantly, China's just about had it with the North Korean regime. They haven't minded when the North Korean regime was poking a stick in our eye. They liked having North Korea to disrupt the Japanese defense alliance with the United States or exacerbate differences between South Korea and Japan. That worked in Japan's favor. But they don't like this regime being so unstable that it creates uncertainty in the region and encourages Japan to increase its military, or South Korea to increase its military, or increase their ties with us. So something that was useful to China is no longer useful, in fact, could be quite disruptive. So China is increasing the pressure. So there's a possibility we could see the renewal, maybe even next year, of the kind of multinational talks with North Korea that can put that program back in a box and maybe, just maybe, convince them to give up the material that they have. Yes, sir?
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you.
We've reached the end of our time. Thank you.
All right, folks, then quick note to our internet audience watching at home. There's still time to call the number on your screen, and we will ship nuclear nightmares to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the Books and Books Situation Room, we have nuclear nightmares. Previous titles, Bomb Scare. They're for sale at the counter in the front room over there. He will be signing here at the table to the left of the podium. And this has been a fascinating presentation. Please give another hand to Joseph Cirincione. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. All right. Thank you very much.